So I am going to start this discussion off with a history. You know, Star Wars is kind of the thing of the day, and so I'll start in a galaxy long, long ago, 10 years ago, when the world started thinking about convergence and what does this change in technology and telecommunications mean. Well, if you think about it, in the last 20 years, we've witnessed a series of remarkable technological advances that have fundamentally changed the way we collect, consume, and disseminate information. And we've heard a lot about that this morning already. Prior to the widespread availability of broadband networks, different forms of communication, telephony, audio, video, media were transmitted through discrete channels. The public switched telephone network was used for voice telephony, and over-the-air broadcast was used to distribute audio and video media. Well, since the early 1990s, as you know, technology has largely eliminated the need for communications channels devoted to a specific mode of communications. And we're now struggling with that change while our laws and regulations have not necessarily kept up with the development of technology. So let's talk very briefly about legal shifts. As is often the case, the law is slow to change in response to new technology. Companies face the challenge of responding to market demands for new technologies that might not neatly fit into the existing regulatory frameworks. So for their part, government regulators face two challenges. First, regulators must determine whether and how to regulate new technologies. For example, the ongoing debate in the US over network neutrality is an excellent example of this struggle. While the FCC clearly desires to impose net neutrality regulations to constrain ISP conduct, the agency has to date struggled with the needed authority necessary to do that. And second, government regulators are sometimes tasked with preserving legacy networks to ensure that underserved populations are not left behind as we engage in technological transitions. So with all of that as the background, I'm welcoming kind of this discussion with our panelists and discussing the policy issues for Reimagined Telecoms. So I'd like to start first with my buddy, Bob Pepper. And what I've asked all three of them to do was to come into this discussion and just talk about the three challenges that they see facing both industry and regulation. And I think Bob is a perfect person to start off with kind of what's happening in industry.
Well, thanks, Reese. And it's great to be here back at PTC. So let me start with the challenge really for the industry, based upon some of our forecasting and what we see. And I think many of you know that we have a forecast we've been doing now for 10 years called the Visual Networking Index, and it's a 5-year rolling forecast. So we look out 5 years on a lot of the aspects of the internet, traffic, devices, behavior, consumer behavior, and so on. And when I look at this year's forecast, what strikes me is that we really have a tale of two networks. The first tale is what's the story about what is driving demand, what is driving the use, what's driving the data consumption. And it's video, video, and video. And we see this globally. You know, averages around the world, about 80% of the traffic on fixed networks is going to be video by 2019. Between 75 and 80% of traffic on mobile is going to be video by 2019. So the demand on the networks is being driven by video. At the same time, the second tale, the second story about the networks, what we're seeing, is the dramatic and explosive growth of the things that are being connected. In fact, we forecast that by 2019, in terms of IP-enabled devices, so not even including the things without IP addresses. In terms of IP-enabled devices, we're forecasting there'll be 24.5 billion devices connected across the world. 10.5 billion of those are going to be machine-to-machine. So in the machine-to-machine world, what that means is that by 2019, 10.5 billion devices, 43% of all of the IP-enabled devices are going to be connected to the internet, are going to be machine-to-machine. But most of those devices are not going to be broadband. They're not going to be continuous. They're not going to be transmitting data. Some will. You know, the surveillance camera downstairs as you come in, or the traffic camera, right? That's video. But most of these are going to be little devices waking up and chirping little bits of data and going to sleep, waking up and chirping a little bit more and going to sleep. So while globally 43% of all the devices are going to be M2M, that's only going to generate about 3% of the traffic. Right? And the requirements for these devices are very different. So the second tail of the network is about machine to machine, this world of Internet of Things, and the complexity of figuring out how do you manage a network for capacity, right? Data and video, different types of video. But then on the same platform, it's going to be all of these billions of little devices waking up and chirping.
And that alone, I think, is a very interesting dynamic. I mean, you hear from a regulator's perspective, when I was there, it was constant streaming. How do we handle the traffic with constant streaming? But you're right. This kind of idea of on, off isn't really something that's
right. And a lot of it's going to happen at the edge, and occasionally stuff's going to come back. So that's really the first big challenge, which is we're in the middle of seeing the beginning of this dramatic transition. And so our network architectures, I mean, are we going to be looking at, you know, how does CDNs fit into that? How do the managed services for managing for complexity fit into that? All of the notions of what network